Stop there.
So now it's running. Just hit stop when you're done.
Okay. Can I minimize this?
Yep.
All right. All right. Cool. Looks like a few more people coming in here. Is everybody in here really familiar with standard CSS and style sheets, right? I haven't lost anybody by saying that, because I'm assuming you understand CSS good and you're interested in taking it to the next level and integrating SassCompass into your workflows. Good. Has anybody in here used SassCompass before, played with it? Have you used it a lot? You're going to be bored. My presentation is basically more of almost a sales tool to get you guys to understand why SassCompass is so wonderful, how you can kind of see what it can do, quickly get you an ideas about where to go to look to get it going, and then let you go. Because it's cool. Pardon? You might get a little confused at times, but my slides will be posted and you can go back and look at it. So, alrighty. So this is SassCompass. My name is Scott Wilkinson. I'm the owner of Halo FX Media in Kansas City. I like to really call myself more a creative problem solver than a developer, programmer, coder, or any themer or anything like that. And I'm a member of the Kansas City Drupal users group. I'm known as Halo FX on Drupal.org and most places around the internet except on Twitter, which it was taken, and then I went with HackMonkey, which that was taken, so we got a 3. I've been using Drupal for about 5.5 years and SassCompass for a little over 2 years. Like I said, I'm going to move kind of quick through some of this stuff to get you just more of an idea of what SassCompass can do, so give you an idea why you would want to integrate it rather than teach you how to integrate it, because the documentation for Sass alone is like 50 pages long and there's no way I can ever teach it to you. And I'm approaching this more from the standpoint that I came into it as a designer, went to art school and all that, and not as a coder or anything like that. So why preprocessors? Why do we want to use SassCompass or anything other than CSS, and what's wrong with CSS? This is a recent quote from Chris Epstein, who is the creator of Compass and the Sass contributor. He said this in a recent Lullabot podcast, and when I heard that, I was like, that's kind of weird. CSS isn't that hard. But I've been using HTML since about 1994. And CSS since it came out in about 1996. I'm an early adopter on everything and like to shoot myself in the foot a lot. So I had kind of been looking myself at Sass as kind of just a natural progression of CSS 1, 2, 3. Oh, we got Sass. So I thought that I would put together a little timeline of CSS and HTML to incorporate into my presentation. And when I did that, then it all came rushing back to me, all these things from the past that I had put out of my memory, and realized that CSS is a pain in the butt. And it's been a pain in the butt ever since the very beginning. Crazy enough, IE3 was the very first browser to support CSS, and when Netscape Navigator picked up support for CSS, I'm going to mix them up a lot. Acronyms. It treated it like JavaScript, so if you had the no script tag turned on, you didn't get CSS. So CSS has been plagued with problems from the very beginning, and don't know that it's going to change much in the future because all the browsers attack everything a little bit differently. So as it turns out, CSS really is kind of hard, and Chris was right. So the idea behind a preprocessor, I've monkeyed up that word. A preprocessor is pretty simple. You write one thing and you get another thing out of it. It can help avoid repetition, speed up your coding of CSS, work around browser issues. Because the conversion from Sass to CSS takes place before the actual browser gets the file. We don't have to worry about whether or not browsers are compatible with Sass or Compass or any of that. That's all handled beforehand. We kick out CSS, we send it to the browsers, everything's fine. Oops. Preprocessors can give us access to variables for colors, fonts, and paths. They can allow for the reuse of common elements. They can make small changes to existing rules by applying additional rules alongside of them or on top of them. They can break down the structure of style sheets and make them a lot easier to manage as well. You can also perform calculations, manipulations, math, and all kinds of stuff inside of our Sass files that will then get kicked out as just regular old CSS as well. So Sass and Less are the two most common preprocessors that are in use today. There's a lot of things in common between the two of them, but there's a couple big key differences that are worth noting. Sass came along first about 7 years ago, and it's definitely the most powerful of the two. Less, which is spelled L capital ESS, and Sass is lowercase or capital case there, started as a scaled down version of Sass. The syntax for Less is very similar to regular CSS, hence the name Less, because Less is actually less powerful than Sass. Less is compiled with JavaScript. It can run at the server side and be compiled at the server, or it can run on the client side when a user visits your site. But either way, there's an extra load that has to be passed somewhere. Less picked up support really quickly from designers because the syntax was so close to regular CSS, and all you had to do was add an include file for a JavaScript library into your file, and you were good to go. However, now that's changed a little bit, and there's tools that you can compile your Less beforehand, but we're not here to talk about Less. Sass, on the other hand, has two sides. It is an extension of CSS, takes regular CSS and just adds to it. And there's also a Sass Ruby app that can compile your Sass files into your regular CSS. The Sass app is a simple command line tool, but I'm not really going to cover it because I don't know anybody that's using it, and it's not nearly as powerful as Compass, and that's really what we want to get to here. So I'm going to still stick around a little bit with Sass because the language of Sass is very important when we get to Compass. This is the Sass website, and it's got a lot of tutorials and some really good documentation and a lot of documentation. So you definitely will want to start there when you start looking at Sass. The confusing part about Sass is there are two syntaxes. There's the older syntax and the newer syntax, but generally when we talk about both of them as the bigger picture, we just refer to them as Sass. So the old syntax used the extension SASS and was pronounced Sass. And then the newer extension, which came in with version 3, has the extension SCSS, which you can see why it's really hard to say. And it's spelled out when you refer to it, so you actually say, oh, it's an SCSS file. The original syntax came from out of HAML, and it's generally used more by the programmatic crowd. It's pretty clean. There's no curly brackets or semicolons in it. It's based on white space as far as how it looks at its embedding. Whereas the newer syntax actually came out of Less, because Less was so much more adopted by the design crowd because they liked the fact that it was so easy to understand because it used the curly brackets that they were used to, and it was much more like CSS. So when the version 3 of Sass came out, they took that away from Less and decided that they would bring back in the curly brackets into it so it's easier to understand for people to adopt and move over to it. So when I say Sass from now on, I'm talking about the big picture. I'm not talking about the first syntax, the second syntax, because the great thing about the two of them is they function identical. So now we're going to look at some code examples of how we can integrate, or what Sass can do. And I apologize here because it is a lot harder to talk about Sass in Compass than it actually is to use it. There's a lot of really crazy nomenclatures, extended variable, and all this stuff, then if I don't write it down and read it, we're going to miss it. So I'm going to be reading off my script here a little bit, so I'm sorry if I sound like a robot a little bit right now. All the concepts in Sass are still valid when we get to Compass, so everything I'm about to show you here fully applies when we get to Compass. Keep in mind that we're talking about Sass. It's all still valid CSS. So when you start learning it, it's very simple to just add as little bit as you want. Just grab little pieces. You don't have to be overwhelmed by feeling that you have to do your entire project and everything with Sass or Compass. You can find one little piece, add that in, get comfortable with that, add in another piece, and that's exactly how I did it. So the order that I'm going to present these code samples is pretty much the order that I began putting them into my own projects. And they generally are going to run from the easier to the more complex. So on the left-hand side is the Sass file, and on the right-hand side is the output CSS from that Sass. And this particular one is showing nesting. So nesting is probably the most basic level of Sass. Selectors are nested inside of other selectors and alongside with declarations. This avoids repetition of parent selectors and can simplify code with many nested selectors. However, you don't want to go crazy. The general rule is don't nest more than 4 selectors deep. You probably are getting a little wild there, and you need to determine if that's really important. Only nest if it makes sense, not because you can. So can you guys see what's going on there? How the nesters or selectors are seeing? Yes? Is it? Okay. Well, unfortunately, these are screenshots, so I'm not sure they can do much about that. Can you guys up front closer see them pretty well? So I don't know if maybe help to move forward or not, but so I'll kind of say a little bit what's going on here. On the first line is an article. So anyway, on the first line of our Sass file, we have an article tag as our selector. And then inside the rules, a margin. But also nested inside of there's an H1 tag. But when that gets output on line 4, you'll see that the H1 is stacked behind the article and they're in line. You keep nesting them inside of each other, and it will keep building them out and adding the selectors together, or the declarations together. That help? Thank you. Okay, so any questions about nesting? Okay, cool. They're usually pretty easy. And variables is the next one here. They are incredibly powerful and easy to use, and when I started playing around with Sass, when I got to variables, I was sold. This made it all worthwhile. Variables are declared like they are in a lot of other languages by using a $sign, and they're set just like regular CSS properties. If they're set outside of a selector, like I've done here at the top of my file, then they're global selectors, and they can be used anywhere inside, or global variables, and they can be used anywhere in the Sass file. If you do put them inside of a selector nested, like say underneath the body tag or something in my CSS, then they would only apply to that particular selector. Math operations can be performed on variables as well. On line 18, for example, here on my Sass file, I've used the darken operation to darken the blue variable by 8 or 10%. As a side note, a few years ago, Facebook did a code audit through all their CSS, and they found that they had declared their blue 548 different ways. And Sass and Sass variables totally fixed that. So, any questions about the variables, how they work?
Does that apply specifically to Drupal?
Nope. It's a CSS thing. Sass and Compass really have absolutely nothing to do with Drupal, no dependencies. It's just something that you can put in your workflow to kick out your CSS that Drupal will then see. So you can use these on static sites, you can use them with Drupal, you can use them with that W thing, however you want. Another really cool thing with using with Sass is parent references, which is a form of nesting. The ampersand is used to pull down the parent selector that's immediately above it. This can be really useful when you're working with pseudo classes like hover or first or last child. So you'll see there on lines 3 and 4, the ampersand on the Sass file are grabbing the div anchor tag from line 1. So when we look over on the output, there's a div A on all 3 lines of our output. And that will work with any pseudo class. Actually, you can use it on anything, but pseudo classes is really where it's designed to be used. Does that make sense? This is really hard to talk about. When I tried to do it without my notes, I was missing stuff left and right and messing things up a lot. So mixins are rules to be defined for reuse. They can include CSS or Sass elements, and the mixin this particular mixin that I'm using creates a horizontal list. And this is actually just a mixin that I created. And you just, mixins are defined with the @mixin declaration, which is on line 1 in this case, and I've named this particular mixin nav list. And then down on line 15, there's the @include, which simply grabs all that stuff that's defined by the mixin and reproduces it in the output on our CSS side. And mixins can also take arguments, which we'll see in just a second. Questions about mixins? Yes? Yeah, are you familiar with the idea of functions? Yeah, they work a lot like functions. You put together your mixin and you define it, and then you can just call it anywhere you want, and it will reproduce that CSS anywhere you want to use it. So if I use multiple horizontal lists on different menus or different structures in my site, I could simply just say @include nav list, and whatever I attach it to will be rendered out as a horizontal list. And I only have to do that CSS one time.
But if you're including, like if you're calling other style sheets in Sass or style sheet, you're calling a mixin sheets, right?
Partials. And we'll get to that in a little bit. All right. So here's another mixin. This one happens to take arguments. And it's a little complex here, but it actually is really cool, and it actually isn't as bad as it looks. So on line 3 of my Sass file, I'm resetting the base font value to the value of 1em or of 1em to 10 pixels. And that's pretty normal stuff. We see that a lot. Then line 4 sets a variable base font size to 10 pixels as well. And those are just the variables there we saw before. Then on line 5, we create a new variable called a rem ratio, and we make it equal our base font size variable from above, and also add the \1em. So then on line 7, the mixin named rem is actually created, and it pulls down, or it has 2 arguments in it. The arguments are key and pixel. And it takes those 2 arguments from the include file on 13, which are font size and 16 pixels. So when you want to use it, you just type it @include rem font size 16 pixels. And then this outputs in our CSS font size equals 16 pixels for older IE browsers that don't know what a rem is. And then just below that on line 6, line 7, we get font size equals 1.6 rem for all the browsers that we really care about. And because we made this a mixin, down there on line 7, I do the @include rem again, but instead of saying font size, I add padding, and now I've used that same mixin again to declare pixel and rem values for the padding on my box class. That was, yeah. Okay, a rem is similar to an em, except they're called a relative, whatever em stands, rem. Relative element, if you put two m's inside of each other, they add on to each other and they screw each other up. Rims don't do that. Does everybody else, anybody know what a rim is? Is that, did I lose anybody there? I'm sorry? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so extends are a little trickier, and I still struggle getting my head around these, but these are another one of the real concepts of Sass. And I'm going to read right now the documentation, or the definition from the Sass documentation, and this is why I have to read it because I would never get this right. @extend works by inserting the extending selector anywhere in the style sheet that the extended selector appears. Doesn't make any sense to me the first time I read it either. So in this example, we have 3 box classes in our CSS, or our Sass file. Box, big box, and little box. The big box and the little box classes render out into the CSS on the right-hand side, just like they normally would, ignoring the extend declaration. But then the big box and the little box classes are added up and behind the box class selector from above it on line 1 in our CSS output. So the end result is that big box and little box end up inheriting the border and margin properties from box as well. And this is a little backwards to what seems like the way I would want to do it. And you could actually do this with nesting, but this gives you a lot more flexibility if you're wanting to, say, apply just a class attribute to individual pieces around rather than, say, mixing a whole big mix-in. Did I lose you with this one? Make sense? You guys are doing better than I did the first time. All right, this is an easy one. Comments work 2 ways with Sass. Single line comments use 2 backslashes, and they do not get compiled out into the CSS because they're not valid CSS. And on line 5 of our Sass file, we can see a single line comment starting with 2 backslashes. Multi-line comments follow standard CSS conventions, and they do get compiled into the CSS. As we can see, there's 2 of them down below in our Sass file, and they both make it over into our output CSS. And they can be actually multiple lines or just 1 line all together, but they have to have that closing asterisk and backslash. So now partials. And this is the last one of our Sass examples. Partials allow us to break out CSS into additional files for importing, but they aren't compiled on their own. Adding an underscore to the beginning of any file name will tell Sass not to compile that file into CSS. The underscore is omitted when we write out the import statement, and the extension is optional. Partials can be very useful if you have something like a common reset file that you want to include in a separate file and then use on multiple sites. Partials. In this example, the color and text partials are used, and you can see them up at the top of my example on both sides there. Colors does not have any selector rules in it, just variables. So you can define those variables and reuse them in multiple files or output files by importing them into your multiple Sass files. But just declare all those variables one time in a single partial. So in that case, only the comments get output. But if you look down at the output there on the first line, you'll see that we have the color variables comment that did make it over because it is a multi-line comment, but it doesn't apply to anything in our CSS. So you want to be mindful of when you are using comments as to which kind of comment you use, if it matters whether or not you want it to show up in your output CSS. Partials make sense to everybody? All right. So now we're going to cover some of the tools that can work with both Sass and Compass extensions without using Ruby, or Sass and Compass gems inside of Ruby. Sass Meister is an online tool which isn't particularly practical for for production use, but it is great for getting your feet wet while you're experimenting and see how things will compile out. This is a zero commitment on your part. If you are still unsure about preprocessors or how they work, it supports Sass, Compass, other preprocessors, and other Mixin libraries as well. So you can just pull up the website, throw in some code, and it'll automatically kick it out on the other side. And if there's an error, it'll tell you. So if you see something cool on the internet, say, how's that work? Pull it up, throw it in, bam, kick it out. CodePin is very similar to Sass Meister. It takes it a little bit further, showing rendered output at the bottom of the page, and allows you to input your own HTML and see how the Sass and the HTML play together. It also has a JavaScript window that I had to hide to fit it into the screenshot, so you can even incorporate your own JavaScript and see how it all plays out as well. And then CodePin also allows you to save your little projects as what they call pins, so you can reuse them later if you wanted to build like a little library of things to come back and reference. Scout provides a self-contained Ruby environment and is based on Adobe Air. Scout is available for Mac, Windows, and is free, and it is really simple to install. This is when I started playing around with Sass and Compass. This is where I started with the app that I started using to compile my files together with Scout. The key configuration options for Scout projects are set up just in the UI. The log view on the right-hand side shows what Compass is doing, and it'll tell you that it's watching files, and if it hits any errors, there'll be output there as well, and it'll tell you that there was an error and something didn't compile right, and usually give you a pretty good idea of what went wrong. Scout has some support for using configuration files for Compass. They're called config.rb files, and we'll look at those a little bit later. But the current version doesn't have much support for adding additional gems if you want to start moving beyond Sass and Compass. There's lots of other libraries you can add in, and it doesn't really work very well with those. It's a pretty bare bones tool, but the next version is supposed to do that. Scout can also watch multiple projects at once if you're jumping between things. I used Scout for about 6 months, and then started just kind of bumping my head against it a little bit and wanting to do a little bit more than what it did. But it's a great little tool if you just want to run it locally on your machine and see what's happening and get started. So after Scout, I moved up to compass.app, which is a Java-based Ruby environment. It uses JRuby. There's no need to install this. You just download it and you run the Java jar and use it. Compass app is available on Windows, Linux, and Mac. It's cheap and receives regular free updates. It can build out new Compass projects or use existing Compass configuration files as well. So you can bring it into another project really easily. Compass app can load third-party Compass extensions if you want, when you get ready to go down that path. The main limitation with Compass app is because it's Java-based. It can be a little sluggish at times, and it can only watch one project at a time. When it's run, it adds an icon into your toolbar for accessing the settings and creating new projects. It even has a little web server built into it for testing. And anybody heard of live reload? It supports live reload with a built-in live reload server, which is really cool. You can load in either a little piece of JavaScript into your code, which is kind of tricky with Drupal, or you can load an extension into your browser, and we'll talk to Compass app through the live reload setup. And when Compass app fires and rebuilds your CSS files, it will send a signal to the browser extension and reload just the CSS in your browser window, so you don't have to keep sitting there banging on F5. Compass app has little pop-up windows with statuses that'll run down the side of your screen when it's running versus a big log view like Scout has. And when it runs into a problem or it builds a new project, it has a big display that'll pop up and tell you what's going on. I used Compass app for about a year, and then I decided that it was time for me to finally force myself to graduate up and actually start using the real Compass Ruby app. And then that brings us to the Compass website. Like Sass, the Compass app is a Ruby gem and runs at the command line. Compass is actually really easy to install on Mac and Windows and some newer versions of Linux. I had a lot of trouble with it getting to install on Ubuntu 10, but it is a piece of cake on Ubuntu 13. It's just like 3 lines you type out and it goes. With a project created, the Compass Watch command will start it monitoring and compiling changes on the fly. Any errors in your Sass will be output as well. And if you can read that at the very top, I've typed Compass Watch, and it says it's starting polling for changes, and Control-C to stop. The Ruby-based Sass app will work very similar to this. However, it can only monitor one file at a time, where Compass can monitor multiple files in an entire project at a time, which is why I don't know anybody that uses the Sass one and always uses Compass. If you need to monitor multiple projects at once with the Compass, you just fire up multiple terminals and type Compass Watch in each terminal window. The reference section on the Compass website has a lot of documentation for all the core Mixins and some really good useful examples on how to use it that you can follow along and just copy and paste out to play around with. They're broke out into sections and organized across the top there of the page. You can see them highlighted there. Each section has its list of individual Compass libraries that are available for import. And there's quite a few of those as well, and I would recommend you just go in there, you start browsing around and finding the ones that look interesting and play around with them and decide if they're something you want to incorporate into your workflow. So now I'm going to start some Compass examples. Before I do that, any questions?
With what you presented so far in terms of less, Sass, and Compass, are those, do they kind of just build one to another, that like you could do Sass just fine without Compass? Compass is just a tool where they have to work with Compass?
Sass and less are two competing technologies. You either use less or you use Sass. Compass is an extension of Sass. So you can use Sass on yourself by itself, and depending on which tool you're using, you don't have to install Sass, but Compass builds on top of Sass, on top of the language. So the idea of mixins and variables and all that that will work inside of Compass all come from Sass.
Would you think it's really weird to go directly into Sass like by itself, or would you be smarter to always use something like Compass to do directly?
We'll look at the examples here, what Compass offers. Compass extends Sass with a lot of really powerful things, so it's kind of one of those deals, it's like once you get into it, yeah, you're going to use Compass. And in myself, now that I've started using them, I can't make the distinguish about which one's a Sass and which one's a Compass thing. I had to actually go look them up because they blur in together. Because they build onto each other, and it's like, well, was that a Sass thing or was that a Compass thing? And sometimes I'll have to remember to which website to go look up the documentation on. But really, once you get into it and they're easy enough to use one and the other, you use them both. There's really no point not to. So earlier in the Mixin example with Sass, I showed this example with the horizontal list, and you can see it took 11 lines for it to output our Sass. When we do that with Compass, using the Compass Mixin for a horizontal list, it takes 3 lines. Most Compass Mixins take arguments. The example of a horizontal list takes 2 arguments, padding and direction. But I haven't defined any here, so it's using the defaults. If no arguments are provided, the defaults are used. Defaults are listed on the Compass reference website, so that's a good thing. Go in there and you look, and the website will tell you which values you can add for arguments that it'll accept, what the defaults are. Sometimes the defaults are fine, sometimes you want to override them. You can stick in variables for defaults. In this case, 4 pixels padding and the left direction are the defaults. And you can see there how it can save you some time and headache with coding errors. See, make sense? Questions? Great. Border radius now has pretty decent browser support in everything, or all the major browsers. But this example here shows us that Compass knows about vendor prefixes and can build them out for us so we don't have to worry about remembering them. The border radius Mixin defaults to 5 pixels radius, but that can be overrode by using the border radius default border radius variable as shown on line 3. We can also pass in any hard values like 10 pixels or variables or a combination of variables. Questions on that? The font face Mixin speeds up the use of web fonts and cuts down on syntax errors. Simply naming a font family for reuse like a variable. In this case, I used juice. Then you list out the file names on the disk for the actual font files that you're using. Then Compass uses the subfolder fonts as a default to look for those files in, but you can define those in your config file or use variables to tell it where they're at in your Sass file. In this case, I imported the same text partial that we used earlier, and that declares the sans variable in that text partial, so when we output on line 12 with our H1, we can see that it's pulling in the web font juice and then adding on Arial and Helvetica as fallbacks as well. Typically when I do something like this, I'll actually include a font declaration like this in my text partial and then store all those in one place, so when I've got a problem with the font, I know exactly where to look in that partial. Any questions on that? Great. Gradients are a piece of cake when it comes to working with Sass and Compass, even with older versions of Internet Explorer. This example reuses the color partial that we used before that defined the red and blue variable. And I'm using 2 Compass Mixins in this example. The first one, background image on line 9, can be used for regular raster images also, and there's a whole syntax for that. But when we use the linear gradient option, it will output gradients. The second @include on line 10 uses the filter gradient Mixin, which provides support for IE6 and through IE8. So with just this one line of code, we can easily have gradients that work all the way down to IE6. I don't know about you, but I don't care about IE6 anymore. So looking at what these 2 lines of code right here are, here's what Compass outputs. And we can see that there's the WebKit browser prefixes, the Mozilla browser prefixes, Opera, the standard linear gradient, and the filter prog ID junk down there on line 12 for IE. I don't know about you, but I don't want to remember that, so I'm much happier using the one include statement that I am all that filter garbage. Compass can also streamline complex box shadows. The first example here is a default, just using straight @include box shadow. There are it has no offsets on it and uses a 5 pixel blur in a medium gray if you just stick with that. The second one reuses our blue variable, and this time we're setting it at a 40% opacity using the RGBA option, and it has a 4 pixel horizontal and a 4 pixel vertical offset, and we're applying a 10 pixel blur. The last example down there on 15 applies 2 shadows. The first one is slightly offset and the second one is actually inset inside of the box. If you'll notice on line 12 and 13, I've used the variables experimental support for WebKit false and experimental support for Mozilla false. These are built-in variables into Compass, and they tell Compass not to render out those browser prefixes. So we output that. Here's our 3 examples. Notice the browser prefixes are only missing down off the last example on line 13. That is because when we look back, they follow the shadow and offset, but they're before multi, so they only apply to multi. And if there were multiple selectors that followed below multi, they would get applied to them as well. And our last example here of Compass, of the hundreds that it supports, are Sprites. Here I'm actually going to use 3 different mixins. The first one is Sprites, which actually aren't a mixin, they're called a utility. Compass Sprites can be used in multiple different ways, but I'm going to show you the most direct and easiest way to use it right here. So on the left I've got an example of HTML, just 3 regular old anchor tags, nothing special about them. And on the right hand side I've got 3 icons and their hover equivalents with the underscore hover added to their names. When we write our Sass file, we use the @import on line 2, but this @import icons PNG tells Compass to look in the icons folder and grab all of the PNG files and create one sprite out of all the files that are in there, and we can see that resulting sprite on the right hand side. Then on line 4, the @include all icons sprites mixin uses the sprite that we created and creates automatically CSS rules for each of the images that are created inside the sprite. I've also included on line 7 the hide text mixin from Compass, and it is used to hide the anchor text inside the text links. So now we'll look at the output. And I had to reformat this a little bit to get it all to fit up into the screen, take out some of the returns. But so here's the output. Compass has created a rule for the background image and 4 classes on line 1. We can see those listed out: icons sprites, icons Drupal, icons RSS, and icons share. It then is created, and that's referencing our sprite that it created on line 2. It then is created background position declarations for the proper offsets for each image, and then created hover pseudo classes for each of the images that had an underscore hover in the file name. The ability to create pseudo classes is called magic selectors in Compass, and it can be default or turned off with a variable if you wanted to be turned off, but it is on by default. Down in the rule for the anchor tag on line 16, Compass has hid the text as well with a negative indent and an overflow hidden. And if we looked at this in a browser, we just see our 4 icons there, and they would all roll over, and all we had to do was write that HTML and that Sass. So any questions about sprites? There's a lot that can be done with sprites, but any questions about that particular part of the example?
Where was that, the original image coming from? Was that an external source?
Yeah. These 6 images here are 6 images that I created, and I put them in there on line 2. You can see where it says icons star PNG. So I had Compass automatically assumes you put images inside of an images folder, and it knows about that, and it expects them to be there. So if you want Compass to know about them, put them in that folder, or you can change that folder as a variable or in your config file if you want. But I told it to look inside of the images file at my icons folder, and then at all the PNGs inside of there and turn them into a sprite. Anything else? All right. I mentioned errors a couple of times, and it's also worth mentioning that not only do errors get displayed on the screen when you're compiling your Sass or Compass in the tool that you're using, but it will also output the errors into your CSS in a way that will get displayed inside your browser when you do a reload. And it's really good about giving you information about what it was expecting, where it thinks the error is, what line, and where you screwed up. I'm not sure, it's pretty small if you can, how well you can see that. But it says syntax error, invalid CSS after font family, expected pseudo classes, or pseudo placement was juice on line 6. And it tells me the file name, and what I actually had done in that case is I had left out an opening curly brace. So if I'd have gone to line 6 there, I'd have seen my curly brace was missing. Any questions over these examples with Compass? All right, you can see that the difference between the Sass and the Compass, the way they work is very similar. You just, Compass is adding on some extra abilities on top of Sass. So we're almost done here. The next thing is integrating Sass and Compass in a Drupal environment, which really isn't a big deal at all. The process for Omega isn't much different than you would use for any other theme with Drupal that you'd want to integrate in with. The only real exception is that Omega provides its own default style sheets to begin with, but they're empty. So as it turns out, on Drupal.org there is already a page that describes how to integrate Sass and Compass with Omega. Ironically, I did not realize this existed until after I submitted my session, but it's pretty much exactly the same way that I do things. So we'll run through that real quickly. So everybody here is familiar with adding a theme to their Drupal site. All right. So you go ahead and you create your Omega base theme like you normally would, and then you would go to the command line, and I'm assuming that we're using Compass at this point, and we would cd into the root folder of our theme where the info file resides. Then we would type Compass watch, the command that I have at the top there, and this will create a CSS folder, or an SCSS folder, which doesn't exist, and it will ignore the existing CSS folder because it's already there, and then it will create a config.rb file as I've shown just below there. And these settings that are in this config.rb file are really basic normal settings for most Sass project or Compass projects, and you can see how it's setting its default for where it's going to look for its Sass files, where it's going to output its CSS files, where it's going to look for images, and where it's going to look for JavaScript if you want to use any JavaScripts with Compass. And then at that point you will copy the default CSS files that were included with Omega out of the CSS folder and into the SCSS folder that I'm using in this example. Sometimes I'll call that Sass instead. It doesn't care what you call the folder. And then just simply change the extension to be SCSS. It does care about the extension, but it does not care about the folder name. And at that point, we simply run Compass Watch, and it takes over, and you're ready to go. So from there, we can create partials to break out our Sass and our CSS structure however we want. This particular example here is a file structure for a site that I'm working on right now with the name Skull5 for the theme name. And this is using Omega 3. The underscore fonts partial pulls in web fonts like I showed before. The Mixins partial is pulling in a lot of common Mixins that I like to use in my sites, including that one for using pixels and rems to declare font sizes. And then the text partial contains basic text styling information for like the body tag, the default paragraphs, headers, code tags, and lists that I would use on different elements throughout the site. Any questions on that? How you do that with a theme? It's really not that big of a deal, is it? So that's the end of what I got here. Any questions? More questions? Did I lose anybody? You all want to run out and start using Sass and Compass right now? See a few heads. All right, I didn't totally screw up. All right, great. Thanks for coming.